Well, hello there, it's Antrice, and welcome to another episode of the Savvy Painter Podcast. This episode is sponsored by Trekell Art Supplies. For over 30 years, Trekell has been obsessed with the art of brush making, and now they're applying that same obsession to professional-grade artist panels. Both their brushes and panels are made right here in California at their Hesperia factory. Go to Trekell.com and use promo code SAVVY16 to get 15% off your next order. My guest today is Kirstine Reiner Hansen. Kirstine is a painter originally from Denmark, now living in Carmel, California. She got her BFA in graphic design and illustration from the Kolding School of Design in Denmark. Her work has been shown in numerous galleries across the United States and in Europe, most recently at the Jack Fisher Gallery in San Francisco, Art Now Gallery in Berlin, and Zhao B Art Center in Chicago. She originally painted observational realism, but then moved to a more experimental and expressive style. She transitioned by moving to more gestural work, painting with much more emphasis on expression and surprise. In this episode, we talk about making that shift and what it felt like. There's often fear in making big changes in painting styles, particularly when the artist moves away from what is both comfortable and selling well. It takes courage, confidence, and an intense drive. Now her process melds collage and photographic elements to allow for that surprise. Part of her work process is closing her eyes, picking collage elements randomly, and then assembling them into a painting. Kirstine and I explore several topics, including her experience as a self-taught painter, the pros and cons of getting an MFA, and keeping your audience updated while leaving yourself the space to be creative and to play. Here is Kirstine Reiner Hansen. Kirstine, thank you so much for being on the Savvy Painter podcast with me. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Can you tell me a little bit about when you started painting? Like, how did you become interested in art? When did you realize that you were going to dedicate your life to it?
I think it must have been when I first started living in San Francisco. I'd moved from the very conservative city of Bern in Switzerland and straight to very groovy Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco.
That's a big change.
Yeah, it was quite the culture clash. And also the light. I mean, moving from Europe to California, it was literally like someone switching on a light switch.
Yes, it's so much brighter here, right? It's like more intense.
Very much so, yeah. It's quite noticeable. I mean, Bern was really beautiful, but it felt like a very restricted place, sort of very quiet and very well behaved. And when I moved to Haight-Ashbury, I lived right on Haight Street across from Buena Vista Park. There was an amazing view from my little studio with like the big trees and the fog rolling in. But right on the park, there was like no less than 3 halfway houses. And well, it's good that they're there, but every morning there was like a couple of crazy characters. There's a lot of crazy characters in Haight-Ashbury.
Right. And they took it up a level. Yeah.
They literally scream and cough really loud every morning, and I could totally hear it. Anyway, just to give you a picture of that. When I lived in Switzerland, I didn't really have an artist community around me, and I was, really quite clueless about the art world. I'd been painting at home by myself in sort of isolation, but I'd sold a few works in a local frame shop. So when I came to San Francisco, I realized that I really needed to start learning about and researching about pushing my art out in the world. So I went and I bought one of those artist self-help books about how to make it as an artist, something along those lines. And since I had a lot of time on my hands at the time, I followed it word for word like a good student. The funny thing is that it actually paid off. I got my art package together with slides. This was in 2003. They still used slides then. And I approached about 6 galleries that I liked, and one of them actually called me back, the Dolby Chadwick Gallery in downtown San Francisco. And I started showing there. So I think I'd consider that a turning point.
Yeah. When you started reaching out to those galleries, were you mailing off packages and, did you create like your whole sort of like artist bio persona?
Yeah.
What was that like?
Yeah, I realized I had to do an artist statement and how to write that, sort of figure that out. I had to get my CV together in a certain way, and all those sort of technical things rather.
Oh, yeah. The things that most people hate doing because you have to sort of talk about yourself and talk about your work and write it all down. And it feels like it's your permanent record.
Yeah, it makes you feel very self-conscious and you just wish someone else would come and write that artist statement for you, But it's a good practice to do because you start considering more things about your work, why you're doing it, what it means, that sort of thing.
Yes. Yeah. Was there anything that you learned by doing that was kind of surprising to you?
Well, really just the fact that you are forced to take yourself more seriously as an artist. Once you start writing your artist statement, you're sort of making a presentation of yourself. So I think that's really valuable and sort of making you feel more like you're a professional artist.
This is the real deal.
Well, and you also realize that the gallery needs that in order to pitch you, as a selling point. They need to know something about your work to talk about it.
Right.
So you have to give them something to work with.
Yeah, you have to give them a launching point and and definitely help them out. I mean, I think that's kind of the easier way, I think, for maybe people to understand it is that the more that you can do to make their job easier, the better results you're going to have. I mean, if the point of you being in the gallery is to get exposure for your work and to sell your work, you want to make it a no-brainer for the people who are in the gallery talking to collectors.
Yeah, that's definitely true. It's a collaboration with you and the gallery owner. You have to work with them.
Mm-hmm. Was there a moment or a decision you made in your career that you feel was a personal success for you?
Let me see. I think for me, making a departure from observational realism that I was doing for years to a more experimental style was something that was actually really hard for me to do. For years, I'd been trying to break up this perfect illusion of reality that I was concerned with, but I just couldn't really find the right way of doing it. There was also something very scary about taking the step and changing what I'd been doing for years, both because there was a sort of comfort in the controlled painting style.
Mm-hmm.
And, when you know exactly what you're doing, how to do it, but also because the work had been selling pretty well. But on the other hand, I knew I just couldn't continue this trajectory of working that way. And, I knew that something had to change. So for years, I'd been using live models in the studio. I'd been very invested in this live dynamic between me and my model. And I was dependent really on friends, mostly to either sit for free or for a small fee.
Right.
And
or a really good dinner.
Exactly. Actually, that's very true. I did use that too. Lunches, dinners. And, I would have them sit for at least 15 sittings to finish a painting. It was quite the marathon.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I know. So when Chris, my husband, and I moved to Brooklyn, I didn't have any friends there and no contacts. So to sort of continue what I'd been doing, I used myself as a model, for lack of better. And needless to say, this became sort of a very arduous and very awkward thing.
Yeah. How did you do that? Did you take pictures or did you have giant mirrors set up?
Well, this is the thing. I used to joke that I would need Botox after sitting with a hand mirror and making faces in the mirror for the longest time. Your face would just kind of freeze and
Right. And then it's not, after a while, it doesn't feel natural anymore. And
right. It's just bad. But I was kind of after this expression and it had to be done from live, which was kind of silly. So after a while, I realized this is silly. I can just start using photo reference. So I did, and then after a while, I also started using photo reference from Googling images on the internet of other people like actresses, reality TV stars, and politicians. And I would start fusing them with my own image, like a imagined kind of self-portrait. So that was kind of the start of changing the way I worked.
Oh, wow. Gosh, there's so much to unpack from there. Because your work before was very, very representational. Like I would put it more on the photorealistic, observational side, right? So very much exactly what that object was. And now you've made this jump now that you've got so much more abstraction in there. There's so much more gesture. There's a lot more going on, I would say, like expressive wise.
Yeah.
Making that change, it's a completely different thought process. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like to make that? That's a giant leap. I mean, it's not like, from what I can see from your work, it's not just like, I'm going to try slowly to move into this direction.
Right. I mean, yeah, it really is from almost two extremes, but because the early work was like so incredibly detailed too, like I just kept going and going with the details, and my work now is so gestural. But in between, from the two opposites, I was doing those self-portraits where I introduced references and merging things in Photoshop to help me create these images. So that was kind of a bridge between the two. But you're right about, I mean, mentally, it was a big change, but it was just something I always wanted to get to. I could mention that when I first started out sort of just painting for myself, self-taught, I was working quite loosely and very experimentally, and I liked that. But then I sort of came to a point where I realized I didn't have enough skill to express myself and create these ideas I had in mind. And that's when I started doing the very detailed sort of old master type paintings, because I wanted to sharpen my skills. I loved doing that for a long time, and also they were selling, but I never really sort of gave up my urges to want to paint more loosely. And it just taken me a long time to get to that.
This is something that I think comes up a lot. I'll get emails from people and they'll say like, oh, okay, well, I'm doing this and it's selling and things are going really good, but I don't want to do this for the rest of my life and I need to change, but I'm afraid to. And
yeah,
because it is scary.
Yeah,
right?
It is.
When your income is so attached to your output, to suddenly change that, I think can be really frightening. How did you get past that?
Well, there was a time, like a couple of years ago, my husband and I moved back here from California. It's a bit of a longer story, but...
You went from Brooklyn back to California, right?
Yeah, we did. We needed to be closer to his dad here in Carmel, and we tried to move to Los Angeles, and that didn't really work out. It was too far from his dad. Then we spent some months back in San Francisco, where I actually got my old studio back in the Mission. But then after a couple of months, we learned that this art studio space was going to be converted into a tech office space. But more than double the rent.
Yes.
Quadruple the rent, probably. And then we decided to move to Carmel and live temporarily with his dad, who was getting weaker. As soon as we moved in, he became quite ill. So it was really good timing that we were able to be here and take care of him. But around that time, it just was a really tough time for me. It was sort of a confluence of really difficult things that happened at the same time.
Yeah.
I was suddenly living in this small town. I didn't know anybody, in someone else's house, and we didn't really know where we're going to be moving next.
Right.
But most importantly, I just didn't know what I was doing with my work. Thankfully, I had a space to work, but it was this room full of my father-in-law's things, like his art materials. He was a really good artist too, but it was also filled with all our moving boxes that were like stacked everywhere. Every way you turned, you just kind of bump into something.
Yeah, I've been there.
So after having finished my last body of work, this self-portrait project with these satirical, more sort of confrontational paintings, I mean, they had really gotten some good feedback. I had a write-up in Juxtapoz magazines, and I got this grant from an art museum in Provincetown, a small show in New York, and one in Hamburg. But the thing was really that they were a very hard sell. The galleries weren't picking me up. And I was just really struggling with what direction to go in. And all the time I wanted to change my style too. So at this particular time, I just felt really discouraged. Sort of considered giving up being an artist. So to answer your question, I think this is why I was able to just make that jump and change my style, the way I worked.
Do you feel like it was sort of a last, if you were thinking at that point about giving up being an artist, do you think that you sort of saw it as like, okay, this is like a last ditch effort. I have nothing to lose, so I'm just going to do what I want?
That's exactly what happened. And I'm not saying like I would recommend that people should get to that point.
No.
To be able to make changes that they want to make. But sometimes it just works that way. You get to a point where you don't have any goals or expectations. Nobody's making any demands on you. And then you have this sort of weird vacuum time where you can feel more free to experiment or find a way, change what you're doing. So I don't really know what to say to people who want to change their work. I would say, definitely, maybe just take some time, give yourself a certain amount of time to not have any shows set up, for example, and then try to make some changes. And it is possible,
Yeah, it is. And I think that when I hear you talk about your story, of course, I'm always thinking about other conversations with other artists. And there seems to be like, when you're first starting out, you kind of are in that position where you can experiment because you don't have anybody watching you, like
right.
You're not in a gallery yet. You're kind of free to just do what you want you don't have to show it to anybody. So it's a great time to just take, if you can do this, because I know that a lot of people, when they're in that stage, all they're thinking about is, oh my God, I got to get in the gallery. I can't, but
right.
The silver lining to that place is that you can take the time to really develop your skills and experiment and play around and follow those tangents that might bring you to a place that you would never get to otherwise. So like the kind of dots that I'm connecting is just, I've remember talking to a couple of other artists that for whatever reason, they were either in between galleries, or oftentimes it happens with a move, it seems like. And you sort of sound like you had the trifecta where you had, you were moving. So, like you have that instability of that. You have a sick family member and you're kind of in between galleries. So
yeah,
if there is a similar lining to that.
That's true. Yeah, definitely being in between things. And I think, you're definitely so right in that you have to give yourself time to just experiment and goof off, and try new stuff and not always think of it as work, It's easy to get into that kind of mode because you have to make a living. But sometimes you lose some of the creativity.
Yeah.
When you're just playing around sometimes.
Yeah. I think what helps me is to just it takes an enormous amount of, I don't know if discipline, but because I'm one of those people where I block everything in my calendar. And so like you do have to just sort of like say, okay, I'm blocking time to just play and paint without any expectations.
Yeah.
That idea of I'm going to work on this piece and nobody will ever see this piece.
Right.
And it's just for me and I can do whatever I want with it. It's kind of like when you, I don't know, in kindergarten where you have the messy room where you can like go in and just like ruin everything.
That's a good way of describing it. I kind of thought of it too, like you could say, well, I'm having my own artist residency at home, or in my studio. And just like you say, set off time, say, okay, this is just free time.
Yeah, it's just playtime.
There's no products after this. It's just for me.
Yeah. I think it's easy to get into the mode where you feel like you have to always have a specific outcome to your work. But I think building, like I call it playtime.
Yeah.
But whatever you want to call it, building that into it where you just make a mess.
Yeah. And sometimes it can just seem like that's even scary believe it or not, it should be like, oh, I'm going to have fun. But sometimes it can seem like, oh, that's scary.
Yeah, no, but it's true. It is.
Out of your comfort zone, perhaps.
Yeah.
You're used to being in control of what you're doing.
Yeah, well, I think it's really interesting, like what you were saying earlier about you kind of started out self-taught and very expressive. And then I think most artists do this. I want to say all artists do this, but
yeah,
you have to kind of know that that the reason that you're choosing, that you're doing the type of work that you're doing is because you want to do that work, not because you cannot draw or you cannot do X, Y, or it's not a way to get around a technical skill that you feel like you don't have. So I think a lot of artists will kind of go through a phase of trying to draw or paint very perfectly and very, very accurately just to know that you can do it. And then it's that whole thing of you have to learn the rules before you can break them. But I think we kind of naturally do that without saying it in that way.
Yeah, it's for a natural progression you have to go through.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think if you're in a MFA program or you're learning to paint in a school, you probably have a little bit of a different way of thinking of how you're going to be working than if you're just self-taught. You're kind of just grasping for, clues here and there.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps it's easier to get direction when you're in a school. You have people who sort of look over your shoulder and go like, why don't you try this? Or you should focus on that, or.
Yeah, it's very true. It's like you've got somebody who has presumably been there and done, like, I think if you've been an instructor at a university or any school for that matter for some time, you kind of know what people struggle with. You can kind of see it coming before they do.
Right.
And so you can immediately go, okay, this is what they're dealing with right now. Here's one way to break them free of that. But when you're self-taught, you have to stumble through and figure that out on your own.
Right. For good and for bad.
Yeah. I don't know if this is an awkward question to ask you, but I know that it's pretty common for artists who are self-taught to feel a little bit self-conscious about it, like somehow they've missed out on something or that somebody's going to discover that they're not really an artist, because they don't have a piece of paper hanging in their wall.
There's something about that, for sure. I think when I sort of started out painting, I didn't really hear about people getting MFAs as much.
Uh-huh.
I was in England at the time, and people would get an MA, and it was when I asked around about that, the answer I would get was like, that was for when you wanted to teach.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much of a sort of personal exploration or finding yourself as an artist. It wasn't so much about that, but that has become more common now, right? But I've definitely been through a period where I thought I should probably have an MFA. That's how you get ahead in the art world,
Mm-hmm.
So I seriously considered it a couple of times, but I just didn't get around to it. and at one point you just find out what it is that you're doing. And I don't think you have to have an MFA.
No, I don't think you do. I don't think you do either. But I do think you have to continually learn and grow. But I think you need to do that with or without an MFA. I mean, an MFA might. And I know, like, I'm in dangerous territory right now because I've talked to people about this before. And I've talked to people who are just insistent that you absolutely must have an MFA. And then other people who are like, yeah, no. And then, I'm kind of like more, I absolutely see the value of it. And in a perfect world, I would be continually in some sort of a university program for the rest of my life. Like, I would just keep, like, if time and money were no issue, I would just collect degrees just because I think it's fun.
Yeah.
But since we don't live in that world,
there's always something to learn. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you can, I don't know, I'm kind of more along the line of my life is sort of my MFA. So I seek out people that I want to study with and just obsess on them for a while and take workshops with them. So it's kind of like my prolonged MFA. But I've had conversations with people who are just adamantly like, that is not the way to do it. And here's 10 reasons why. So.
Right. Yeah, I don't. It's kind of a.
We all have our own path.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm not against MFAs. I definitely, when I've gone to visit programs and I see what they're doing, I'm always a little bit jealous of the students in there. I'm like, oh my God, that would be so much fun. Do you guys realize what you have? Soak it up,
Yeah, no, I'm sure I would have loved to go through a program like that. I mean, one of the things I think I missed out on is that you learn a lot more about sort of questioning what you're doing, your intent, and sort of analyzing a little bit about what you're trying to do and also writing about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is huge.
Yeah, it is. It's really a good thing. And I've kind of had to pick up on that.
Yeah, and then you also have, presumably you have instructors or you have the professors there who are challenging your thought process. And that's something you really can't do by yourself unless you're super diligent in seeking out mentors or seeking out people that will challenge you in that way. But it's sort of like an intense 2 years of only working and thinking about all those things.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about the MFA programs to say like whether when you get out of it, perhaps people, I mean, hopefully they keep changing.
Mm-hmm.
I hope it's not something where a lot of people just like, well, get fixed into this is what I'm doing. This is my thing. That makes sense.
No, it does. Yeah, it makes total sense. And I would imagine just like anything else, there's like a range of that of people who either because of their personality or because of what they've been taught lock into a certain thing and don't want to change. And then there's others for the same reason, either because of their personality or because of the school that they happen to go to are going to just continually be challenging themselves and questioning everything and spending a lot of time in the messy room.
It's funny too that especially these days, I think it's so, unfortunately, in a way, it's become so important to have a brand that I am the artist who does this and this. You have to be instantly recognizable.
Right.
Especially with all the, online marketing.
Yep.
The way people view your work is always on a small screen, probably, maybe a smartphone. And you have to they have to see, like, remember who you are and what you do. So there's a lot of pressure, I think. And I think the MFA program probably helps you to sort of crystallize, like, what you're about.
Yeah.
And it's just become really important, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
Definitely something to give some thought. And I kind of think it's unfortunate, of course, too, because art shouldn't really be about that.
Yeah, I mean, I see both sides of it. I think people in galleries need to know what to expect from you in some ways, right? Mm. But on the other hand, you need to be free to create. So, I mean, maybe I'm too literal or practical about it, but my take on it is like, okay, you can have the work that you show on quote unquote officially online, whether that's on your own webpage or in the gallery. And then hopefully you are experimenting and you can show that or not show that.
Right.
I don't know. I mean, I'm like, it's a weird way to sort of solve the problem, but I'm kind of like, okay, I don't always have to have the camera on.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's hard for people to do sometimes because I think there's a lot of pressure to constantly be showing your work and constantly be doing stuff. And it was a hard transition for me, but I finally got to the point where it's like, I feel like I can have my private space and I'm okay with that.
Right. Yeah, it's really become important to keep feeding your audience or your perceived audience with updates to show that you're still doing something, you're still alive.
Yeah.
Like, this is something I'm working on, or here's my paintbrush, or
right.
On social media.
Yeah. I think what's fascinating about that too is, I don't know, I'm speaking for myself right now, but I think as an artist, sometimes I feel like I have to show something really great or really important. And I've actually called up people who collect my work and said, okay, let's talk about that. It's like, why do you collect my work? What was it? Now that you've had it in your house for 5 years, are you sick of it yet? Like, why did you collect for me and stuff? And then also with some of them, I was asking them about social media, and it really surprised me how interested they are in things that I would consider sort of mundane or boring, or, you know, like, because you were kind of joking about taking pictures of your paintbrush or your palette or whatever. And I found out that they love it. They really like, yeah, I wish you would do more of that. And I'm like, really? Okay. All right.
That's actually great to know. Yeah. Maybe it's just because we're not the audience of our work. So
yeah,
we don't find it as fascinating.
Exactly. Or yeah, it's something you see all the time and blah, blah, blah.
It's good.
Yeah.
I mean, there's something really awesome about being able to share your thoughts and work in progress. And I think it's probably more positive than negative, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
That's my conclusion.
I agree. I'm with you on that. This episode is sponsored by Trakell Art Supplies. Trakell Art Supplies makes custom panels from their factory right here in California. High-quality panels are made to order and shipped directly to your home or studio. Choose from lightweight gator foam panels, birchwood panels, or aluminum. Here's Pro Team artist Sean Cheatham talking about Trakell panels.
The first time I used just their straight wood panels that were gessoed. But what I've been really liking is their linen, oil-primed linen on either dye bond or gator board. The ones on gator board are so light, which I love. I brought a bunch with me to Rome, and I don't love painting on linen anymore. I think it's beautiful and fancy and all that stuff, but I like panel. I like smooth panels, but those linen panels with the oil grounds, I was very impressed with. And I think actually ended up being some of my favorite paintings consistently that I did in Rome when I was maybe only doing 1 in 4 on those panels. But I love how light they are, and I think glue that's removable anyway, so you just get the linen if you want to remove it later. But for traveling, it's amazing. They're so light.
Go to Trakell.com and use promo code SAVVY16 to get 15% off your next order. This is another, like, one of those things that I think artists spend a lot of time worrying about, and it turns out to be something that I think is just not a big deal. But your choice to switch from observational to using photo reference, why was that difficult for you?
I think because I was so invested in this sort of live dynamic of me and the sitter of the portrait. I was very involved in portraiture. That was kind of my thing for a long time. At that time, it was just so important. I couldn't imagine painting from a photograph. That wasn't exciting enough.
Uh-huh.
But it just became impractical, both because of finding the sitters and also having the actual space enough to set up such a situation. And then also sort of financially, it was time consuming and,
expensive.
15 sittings, expensive, and it took a long time. And comparing it to what I was making from selling the work, I mean, it was kind of the least of my considerations, but all in all, it just didn't interest me as much. So that's got to be at the bottom of it, I think.
Uh-huh.
Because you always find a way, I think, if you're really passionate about something.
Yeah.
But I think again, coming back to sort of sometimes when you make a physical move, a lot of other things change in the way you perceive your art, for example.
Yeah. And
having to adapt to a new situation. I think I just realized I needed to adapt not only to a new place, location, situation. I also had to adapt to a new lifestyle. So it was hard for me. I was like, I didn't want to do it. When I did start to use reference, it wasn't such a big deal. It's like, yeah, this is fun. I don't need to sit and wait for the model and,
Right.
There's a lot of positive sides about it.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel like there are specific reasons to paint from life. And if you are pursuing those particular reasons, then photography is not going to work for you. And vice versa, right?
Right.
But I think my perception, at least, and the perception of, I think, a lot of other artists that I've heard from, in my case, I studied the philosophy that I studied under. It was definitely life drawing. I mean, everything was about life drawing and setting up models, and that's just what you did. And so I had this perception that if you worked from a photograph, you were cheating or you weren't really,
right. Yes.
And it's such a weird thing, but it took me a long time to get over that. Like, it's okay.
Yes. That's very much what I was involved into. Or it's just like, I sort of really believed that I couldn't have the same experience, the same excitement about the work, that would just disappear and everything would be flat and boring. But it just wasn't true for me anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can find other ways of being excited about the work.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know. I think that it's another one of those natural progressions, and possibly, at least in my case, I think possibly it's back to when you're first starting out and you're trying to learn the technical skills.
Yeah.
Then it's super, super important. And I would still say that there's not, it's still difficult for me right now to acknowledge that there's another way to do it other than to do it from life. Like when you're learning.
Yeah. No, I mean, when I teach students, I still like to maintain that you have to work from life for some time because it's so different.
Yeah.
Than from working from a 2D surface,
Yeah.
It's really important.
And then as your skills grow and you progress and you become, I think at that point, your primary focus usually is the technical side of painting, like developing those skills. And then once you've developed them, then you can go on and do other things and it's not such a big deal.
Right. It's like you have to go through that.
Yeah. You have to learn how to walk and then you can start running and jumping on trampolines.
Right. I mean, you kind of find a method of working that works for you. Sometimes it's kind of painful, like it was in my case. But I sort of started purposely creating my own set of rules because I start with a collage that is only for inspiration for when I'm painting. Sort of look at it. But when I create the collage, I sort of have this present random elements to see how I'll find a creative solution. For example, sometimes I'll even close my eyes and pick things and put them together and then open my eyes and like, okay, what do I do now?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
This is perfect because you are actually on your own segueing into my next question, which is I want to hear about your process and stuff. So you literally just close your eyes and pick stuff and then figure out how to work with that?
Yeah, sometimes I feel it's the only way I can be fresh about the work and present myself with something surprising than if I consciously pick elements to put, to try to fit together. So I wanted to be, fresh. And so really, I mean, the most exciting thing for me about working this way when I'm painting from the collage is that I'm seeing the work as some kind of intuitive puzzle where I have to keep very alert to see what step to take next. So it's really like a collaboration between me and the painting.
Right.
The painter, David Sally, he has an interesting angle on this. He sees the painting as having its own personality that develops independently of you. And I kind of feel that way too. It's like it's growing by itself. It's becoming a thing, a creature, in a way.
Yeah.
And you sort of have to listen to it or look at it to figure out what to do next.
I love that. It sounds so interesting, and it sounds like that you give over to your intuition and don't try to control what's happening, and you're there as a partner in this. Yeah,
I think when I was working more realistic painting, it also happened, not the sort of randomness, but the sort of the collaboration or looking at the work, trying to figure out what to do next. But sort of waiting for feedback from the painting. It sounds a little bit hazy or something, but
it sounds crazy until you know that like you've got an audience of almost 100% artists who are probably shaking their heads right now and go, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. If you were in a room full of like any other profession, they would just kind of turn their head to the side like a puppy who doesn't really understand what's happening.
What? Yeah.
I hear some strange noise. I don't get it.
I'd be curious about other painters if they see the work as a puzzle, or some painters paint, they start in one corner and then they continue and filling out the space kind of thing. There's so many ways of doing it.
Yeah.
I like to look at it more holistically, where I sort of jump around from corner to corner and zoom in and out. And
yeah, interesting. I was just thinking, like, what do I usually make a big mess? I will lay something in general, the colors and stuff. Like, I'm not like I know a lot of artists who grid things out and they do it perfectly the first time. And sometimes I wish that I did that.
Easier. No.
Yeah. But I don't know if it's impatient or what, but I make a big mess and then I'll pull things back out of it. And I try to, like, it depends on what I'm doing. Like, sometimes I'm a little bit more structured about it, but the majority of times that's how I start it.
I like that way because it seems more organic.
Yeah.
Or holistic. Like your imagination is involved the whole time.
Yeah. I think it just, I don't know, it feels more like there's more of a creation versus copying, just for me specifically. And that's, even though my work is pretty straightforward, like what ends up at the end is pretty straightforward. There's nothing like, I'm not pulling like random objects like you are and putting them in, or like Chris putting monkeys and and astronauts together. So that's what I mean when I say it's pretty straightforward.
You do work from photo reference sometimes, or do you do a bit of both?
I do both. Yeah, I do. I'll do a lot of plein air painting just because I love being out there and I love the challenge of it. You've got a very short amount of time to get it done before all the light changes.
Yeah.
But then I also love to take my time and just play with the materials in my studio. I think I'm more like, I love the texture of paint. So I like to play with that.
Yeah. I mean, do you do sometimes combination of the two? Like you start something outside and then you play with it in the studio afterwards?
Yeah, I do. Usually I'll start another painting of the same subject though, because for some reason I feel I'm more kind of repressed, I guess, like when I'm working on something that I've already done, because I have this feeling in my head that I don't want to ruin it. Like, okay, I'm just gonna, or I don't know. I'd have to think more about what exactly I'm feeling at that point. But it is sort of like I'm more, restrained or something when I have something that I've done outside. I bring it back into the studio. I feel like I need to stay true to what was happening before. And since I'm not there anymore, I have this sort of disconnect. So the way that I get around that is just start a bigger one, or like either one extreme or the other. Like I'll go down to like a 3-inch painting, like a tiny, tiny, tiny thing, or I'll go big, but I won't do it the same size because somehow that makes a difference to me.
Right. You're not just kind of copying the same image. You're actually creating a new version. I like the idea of versions, actually, or versions of the same imagery or idea.
Yeah.
Because every one of them will be very different.
Always.
And you're exploring something new every time but in a deeper way, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I used to not necessarily be interested in doing that. There was something that just felt repetitive about it. And then somehow I made the connection between like music. So this might sound really weird. This is funny because usually I'm asking everybody else about this. But to put it one way, I always wondered about David Bowie and the song Changes and if he ever got tired of singing that song, like, did it get to the point where he was just like, for God's sakes, do I have to sing that song again? So to kind of bring that back to painting, it sort of felt like I have a musician friend who told me like, no, it's kind of like, because I asked him that question, like, do you get sick of playing your big hit, the one that everybody wants to hear?
Right.
And he's like, no, it's kind of like I get to play with it. Like I know the song inside and out, and I get to find new places to sneak things in and to explore and to really, really get to know it. And so I kind of brought that idea into my painting. I'm really obsessed with glaciers, and there's a couple glaciers that I've painted over and over and over again. And to me, they're never the same. And I'm always playing with, can I do it with one hand tied behind my back? Like, can I do this painting without blue in it, but make it feel like there's a lot of blue in it by tweaking the colors around it? like things like that. For that reason, I'm totally fine. I think I have one glacier that I've done probably 10 or 15 times, and I still am not done with that image.
That's kind of cool because there is always something more to see. There's always something more to explore.
Yeah.
Especially when you start knowing that subject matter so well.
Right.
But then you realize there's more. Do you know the German-British artist Frank Auerbach?
Yes.
Yeah. I love his work. And talking about this, it makes me think of him because he has these like restrictions by just having like 2 people or something that he paints every single day, and he's worked with the same people for decades.
Oh, wow.
So talk about having the same subject. When you see his paintings, they're like so exciting. So he's definitely not bored with studying that.
With the same people. Yeah, that's so interesting. Because I imagine he's seeing them, if he's been working with them through decades, he's seeing them change physically.
That's true.
But then also when I was talking with, do you know the painter Anne Gale?
Yeah.
I was talking to her, and a lot of her paintings will take a year to do. And she uses natural light. So she's got a model and she's using natural light. And so every day there's the day-to-day changes just based on the weather, but then there's other changes based on the season. So wow. She's kind of like, it was really interesting to hear her talk about that, and to hear her talk about things like, oh yeah, there was this one time where I was doing this painting and I started it and it takes like a year, takes that long to do. But then November rolled around and I realized that the light was like, I'd been sort of struggling. I'm paraphrasing what she's saying, that she'd been sort of struggling with something. And then, like November comes and the light changes, and all of a sudden she realizes like, oh my God, that's what I started with. And that's what I've been sort of missing, is this particular light. And so I was like, well, so what did you do? And she's like, well, then I had to change it to that light again. I'm like, after a year of working on this. And she's like, yep.
That's incredible. I mean, that's real dedication to be willing to wait and see and keep changing and until it just feels right,
Yeah. Yeah. She's another one that just so you know, like the paintings talk to her as well.
I love her work. She's incredible. I've seen it here in San Francisco and around the place.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
We've kind of talked about this a little bit, but I want to just ask you, what are you working on right now, or what are you currently obsessed with?
I just finished a show at Jack Fisher Gallery in San Francisco, and another show in Berlin with Art Now Gallery. So I'm kind of starting a new body of work, but it's a continuation of what I've been doing with the collage-inspired, sort of semi-abstract, figurative work. And it's still with the appropriating elements from fashion and art historical paintings. But I guess I have an ongoing obsession with sort of becoming ever more free and experimental with the paint work, and with taking chances and being bold and daring, more authentic.
Yep.
But because I want to retain elements of this tight realism that I also really love to do. It's a constant challenge to balance the 2 polar opposites.
Yes.
And it's sort of, I think that maybe that tension is a good thing. I like to think of it as it's like caring but not giving a damn at the same time, if that makes sense.
It does.
It's like a continuous thing.
And that's what I think at least keeps it so interesting, and how we can still be doing this when we're 80 and not bored at all.
Right, exactly.
Kirstine, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me. This has been a delightful conversation.
Oh, that's been really great. And thank you so much for having me.
It was an absolute pleasure and honor to speak with Kirstine about her work. Go to savvypainter.com and click on the podcast link. You'll find the show notes for this episode there. So head on over, check out our paintings, and get links to connect with Kirstine, plus links to everything that we talked about in this episode. And while you are there, sign up for the Savvy Painter email list. In addition to weekly updates, you'll get free guides and special cheat sheets to help you in your studio. Just click on the yellow button in the sidebar to sign up for that. I want to give a big thank you, as usual, to supporters of this podcast: Amy Fitzgerald, Kathy Beeler, Tracy Everly, Jiyoung Kim Studio, Karen O'Connell, Barbara Chantre, Kathy Naus, Alchemy Works, Jeanette Gray Art, Patricia Matrenga, Deb Cook-Shapiro, Denise Klitzy, Christine Rasmussen, Greg Decker, Barbara Chantre, Abby McRae, Winslow Art Center, Gail Height, and Barry Koplowitz. Thank you so, so much. Next week, Jenny Gardner will be on the podcast with me. Until then, this is Antrese Wood with the Savvy Painter Podcast. Thank you so much for listening.